Drivers who report encounters with the not deer often describe a moment like this. You're on a quiet mountain road late at night, the kind where your headlights carve a narrow tunnel through the dark. The forest crowds the edge of the pavement, and the only sound is the hum of your engine. Up ahead, something steps out of the tree line. At first, you assume it's a deer. The shape is right, the height's right. The stance is almost right. But as you slow down, something doesn't add up. The animal stands too still. Its legs look slightly too long, or the angles seem off. It's as if the joints don't quite line up the way a deer should. When your headlights hit it fully, the creature doesn't flinch, doesn't blink, doesn't behave like prey startled on a roadway. It simply watches, holding its position with a focus that feels deliberate. Some witnesses say the head turns further than it should. Others say the torso looks compressed or the chest too narrow. A few describe the eyeshine as the wrong color, amber instead of white, or flat instead of reflective. And almost everyone mentions the same moment of realization, the instant where the shape still says deer, but the behavior doesn't belong to any animal they've ever seen. When the creature finally moves, it does so silently. No stumbling, no bounding leap, none of that clumsy urgency deer show when frightened. It steps away in a smooth, measured motion, vanishing into the dark as if the forest simply absorbed it. Again and again, people who encounter these creatures describe the same thought. That wasn't a deer. Welcome to Arcane Station. I'm your host, Mike Porter. Tonight, we're exploring one of the strangest modern creatures to emerge from Appalachian folklore, the not deer. This isn't a legend inherited from some dusty archives or a cryptid with a century of newspaper clippings behind it like Bigfoot. The not deer exists almost entirely in the space between first-hand testimony and cultural memory, built from people trying to describe an encounter with something that looked like a deer until it didn't. Most modern reports come back from online posts, forum threads, and community discussions where ordinary people recount late-night drives or encounters deep in the woods. These aren't official wildlife cases or police reports, and I want to be upfront about that, but the consistency is what makes the phenomenon worth examining. When people who live around deer, who hunt them, who know their behavior intimately, describe something that violates the animal's anatomy or instincts, it's worth investigating. Part of that investigation means addressing what deer actually do. We tend to think of them as timid, predictable herbivores that graze, flee, and avoid confrontation. But deer biology is more complicated. In the wild, they've been documented eating small animals like mice and birds, and even scavenging from carcasses or gut piles left behind by hunters. They chew bones for minerals. They behave opportunistically when resources are scarce. Understanding that helps us separate genuine anomalies from misinterpretations of natural behavior. But even with that knowledge, not deer reports include details that don't fit known biology. Unusual limb proportions, joints bending the wrong way, deliberate observation rather than instinctive flight, and movements that don't resemble any gait seen in deer or other local wildlife. And these descriptions aren't coming from a single region or community. They appear across Appalachia and increasingly across the country. Tonight we're going to approach this phenomenon honestly. First, we'll dig into the deep cultural and historical background, indigenous traditions, early settler beliefs, and stories that shaped the region long before the term not deer existed. Then we'll move into documented testimonies themselves. From there, we'll explore interpretations ranging from the biological to the spiritual. And finally, we'll consider the broader implications of what people may be encountering. Let's start with the oldest layer of this mystery. Long before the term not deer appeared online, the Appalachian region already had a vocabulary, spoken or implied, for animals that looked familiar but behaved in ways that pushed beyond the natural world. Understanding these older traditions matters, not because they directly describe the modern phenomenon, but because they show that the people of this region have long recognized a category of beings that mimic animal shapes without fully belonging to them. Among the Cherokee who lived across large portions of the southern Appalachians, there are stories of asigda, a broad term for spirits that could take visible forms. These forms were often close to real animals, but carried subtle inconsistencies, movements too smooth, joints too flexible, or behaviors that reflected intentional observation rather than instinct. These stories were not offered as cryptozoology, but as descriptions of how the physical and spiritual worlds sometimes overlapped. The point was never that a deer was secretly a spirit. It was that some spirits used familiar shapes to move through the world without startling people unnecessarily. The Shawnee, whose historical range extended through what is now West Virginia and Kentucky, spoke of trickster spirits that could imitate animals or mislead or test hunters. These beings were not described as monsters or predators. Their defining feature was behavioral incongruity, a fox that didn't run, a bird that didn't fly, or an animal that held eye contact the way a person might. In these accounts, the moment of recognition was crucial, the shift from seeing an animal to understanding that something else was occupying the form. The Monacan people of central Virginia kept stories of shadow animals, beings that appeared in the shapes of deer or elk, but moved with an unnatural lightness, as if they lacked the full weight of a living creature. These encounters were not necessarily seen as dangerous, but they carried significance. They appeared at times when the boundary between the visible and invisible world was considered thin. Further south, the Catawbas described beings that sometimes adopted animal shapes, but exhibited elongated limbs or unusual posture. These weren't meant as literal zoological statements. They reflected a worldview in which form was less important than intention. A creature's purpose, message, warning, or simple presence defined its identity more than its physical outline. When European settlers arrived in Appalachia, they brought their own set of beliefs. The Scots-Irish in particular carried folk traditions involving shape-shifting beings like the pucka, creatures that could appear as horses, goats, or deer, with proportions just slightly off. The pucka wasn't inherently evil, it was a liminal figure, an entity that occupied the boundary between familiar landscape and the unseen. Settlers who encountered animals acting strangely in the mountains often interpreted them through this existing mythic lens. A deer standing too still or watching too intently wasn't just a deer. It might be a trickster or spirit in disguise. As these cultures interacted, their traditions blended. By the 18th and 19th centuries, frontier diaries occasionally mentioned deers that were moving as though they were jointed wrong, or animals whose eyes looked aware in a way deer do not. These entries typically appeared without elaboration, as if the writer didn't consider the observation remarkable enough to analyze. That in itself says something about the regional mindset. The unusual was noted, not necessarily questioned. Local newspapers from the late 1800s and early 1900s sometimes printed letters from rural residents describing oddly proportioned deer or unexplained animal sightings near homesteads. These accounts didn't spark panic or sensationalism. They were presented as curiosities, bits of community lore shared in the same breath as weather patterns or sightings of strange lights on distant ridges. By the early 20th century, Appalachian communities had their own informal rules about deer that behaved unnaturally. In some areas, elders warned children not to follow deer that stood too close or stared too long. In others, seeing a deer walk silently on hard ground without the usual snap of twigs was considered a sign that the land itself was unsettled. These weren't written doctrines. They were inherited through family stories and quiet caution. So when the knot deer emerged as a named phenomenon online, many locals didn't see it as a new idea. They saw it as a label for something older. something that existed in the cultural memory long before it entered digital conversation. The modern reports differ in tone and detail, but the underlying theme persists across centuries: a creature that wears the shape of a deer, but behaves in ways that reveal it is something else entirely. When we shift from cultural background into the modern era, the nature of the evidence changes. There are no wildlife reports, no police files, no ranger statements documenting a creature that looks like a deer, but anatomically contradicts one. What we do have are first-hand accounts: drivers, hikers, hunters, and rural residents writing online about moments when the seemingly ordinary deer revealed something fundamentally wrong. These testimonies don't originate from horror fiction forums. They come from places where people asked genuine questions, trying to make sense of an experience they can't categorize. The consistency across their descriptions doesn't prove the phenomenon, but it does establish a pattern worth taking seriously. One of the most influential accounts comes from a user posting under the name &.sis on the subreddit Appalachia. He describes riding his motorcycle up to an overlook off the Blue Ridge Parkway near Waynesboro, Virginia. Late at night, heading back down the mountain at a cautious speed, he encountered what he assumed was a deer standing at the roadside. As his headlights illuminated it, the proportion looked subtly wrong. The legs seemed too long, the chest oddly shaped, the head wider and heavier than a typical deer. When he tried to startle it with his lights and engine noise, it didn't react, and when he stepped toward it across the center line of the road, the creature rose onto its hind legs. He later wrote that it moved in a way he'd never seen an animal move, jerky in some ways, too smooth in others, before disappearing off the edge of the overlook into the night. That account circulated widely, not because it was dramatic, but because dozens of readers responded saying that they had seen something similar. The reoccurring theme wasn't the exact shape of the creature, but the moment of realization. The instant when the witness recognized that the animal's behavior didn't match the form their eyes registered. Another user in the same discussion described a nighttime drive in northern Georgia. They were with a cousin, traveling through the back roads bordered by dense timber. A figure appeared in the headlights. As they approached, they realized that the deer was standing upright. It didn't run, it didn't flinch, it simply watched their car pass. The witness emphasized that it wasn't the posture that disturbed them as much as the stillness, the complete absence of twitching, shifting, or head movement common to real deer. A third commenter, writing from Ohio, recounted driving home around midnight and seeing what they initially thought was a deer grazing near a ditch. But as they slowed down, the animal lifted its head in a way that the witnesses described as too fluid, turning without shifting the front half of its body. And then, without warning, it straightened up on its hind legs. The witnesses didn't stop the car to look more closely. They accelerated and drove straight home. Later, searching for any similar descriptions, they found the not deer term for the first time. These three accounts come from different states, but together they reveal a pattern repeated across many online testimonies: a deer-like form that violates expected anatomy or behavior without warning, and often at very close range. Outside of the Appalachia subreddit, not deer encounters appeared in a range of online spaces. A widely circulated Tumblr post from the 2010s described a driver on the Blue Ridge Parkway encountering a deer-shaped figure that seemed assembled wrong. The writer emphasized that the eyes and the proportions were too tall, too angular, too aware. Unlike a deer frozen in panic, the creature seemed to be evaluating the driver. The post became a backbone of early not deer lore, not because it was more dramatic than others, but because readers immediately recognized the details from their own experiences. On Reddit, users in states outside of Appalachia began contributing their own accounts. A post from a Midwestern user described encountering a large deer-like silhouette that appeared on the roadside around dusk. As the driver slowed, the animal shifted its weight in a way that the witness found deeply unsettling. as if the joints didn't align properly. The user didn't have a name for what they saw at the time. They only learned the term not deer later while looking for comparisons. Another account came from someone hiking alone in the Adirondacks of New York. They described seeing a deer between two birch trees, unmoving, even as they approached within visible distance. The witness noted that the eyeshine was the wrong color and that the animal's chest and neck looked strangely compressed. When they tried to angle around it for a better view, the creature stepped backward. Something a deer could technically do, but not with the fluidity the witness observed. Then it slipped out of sight in near total silence. In Canada, a number of online posts reference a deer-like figure acting abnormally in rural Ontario and Quebec. One commonly shared story comes from a wildlife photographer who claimed to have seen a deer standing with unusually elongated limbs near a lakeshore just after sunrise. As he lifted his camera, the creature pivoted its upper body sharply, without the typical sequence of head, neck, shoulders that deer normally follow, and it vanished behind a ridge. The photographer admitted he couldn't say what he saw with certainty, only that it did not move like any deer he had filmed before. Across these stories, several themes recur. The creature either stands too still or moves too fluidly. The legs or neck appear subtly or dramatically out of proportion. The eyes do not reflect correctly in headlights or flashlights. The animal does not behave like prey. It doesn't flee, flinch, or twitch, or scan for danger. Witnesses often feel observed, not stumbled upon. None of these details prove the existence of a distinct creature, but the repetition of these elements across Appalachia, the Midwest, the Northeast, and parts of Canada makes the pattern difficult to dismiss as coincidence. What strengthens the case is not the drama of any single story, but the consistency across dozens of accounts written by people who do not know each other and have no incentive to embellish. Many explicitly state that they are familiar with deer, local wildlife, or even hunting and tracking. They acknowledge the limits of memory, the distortions of fear, and the possibility of misinterpretation, but almost universally, they insist that what they saw did not behave like any deer they'd ever encountered. Modern reports of the not deer exist in the space between anecdote and folklore, a gray area where personal experience, cultural expectation, and the unknown intersect. And while anecdotal evidence can never carry the authority of physical proof, it can reveal a pattern of human encounters that point towards something more than just simple misidentification. So when people encounter something that looks like a deer but behaves in a way deer shouldn't, their interpretations fall into a few broad categories. None of these explanations alone account for every detail in the testimonies, but together they form a clearer picture of the questions surrounding the not deer phenomenon. A natural starting point is biology. Deer are often treated as harmless, predictable herbivores, but that's a simplified picture. In reality, deer are adaptable foragers. They've been documented eating small animals like mice and injured birds, as I said before, as well as scavenging gut piles left by hunters and chewing on bones for minerals. This opportunistic behavior surprises people because it contradicts the cultural stereotype of the deer as gentle vegetarians. And in low light or stressful conditions, unusual behavior from a normal deer could be easily misinterpreted. But this biological flexibility doesn't explain the anatomical anomalies described in many of the not deer encounters. Limbs that appear too long, joints bending unnaturally, or movement patterns that don't match the known gait cycles. Chronic wasting disease, often mentioned as an explanation, can cause stumbling, tremors, and abnormal posture, but it doesn't produce new joint structures or silent fluid locomotion. Nor does it account for standing on two legs with balance and control for longer periods than just jumping up to grab something from a tree, which is something that deer are physically capable of, but only for brief, unstable moments. From a psychological perspective, there's a challenge of nighttime perception. Humans are visually poor at interpreting shape and depth in low light. Headlights flatten shadows and elongate limbs and could distort angles. A deer at an odd stance or caught mid-motion can look unnatural for a split second. Witnesses often acknowledge this possibility themselves, yet many modern testimonies explicitly describe not a fleeting shape but a prolonged observation, long enough for the witnesses to assess posture, movement, and behavior in detail. Then there's the behavior itself. Deer are prey animals. They react instantly to threat. They twitch, test the air, flick their ears, and bolt at the slightest provocation. The consistent element across not deer accounts is the absence of these reactions. Whatever the witnesses saw did not behave like prey. It watched, evaluated, or held its position in ways that suggest deliberate control rather than instinct. This disconnect between expected behavior and observed behavior is what pushes many people toward interpretations outside of classical wildlife biology. Comparisons often arise to beings in folklore that occupy the boundary between human perception and the natural world. Not the indigenous spirits discussed earlier, but global parallels that reflect the same conceptual space. Creatures that mimic familiar forms but reveal their otherness in subtle ways. In Celtic folklore, the puka is a shape-shifting being that often takes animal form. It can appear as a horse or a goat or even a deer with proportions slightly off, or with movements that betray intelligence beyond the animal it imitates. The puka isn't a monster, it's a liminal figure associated with threshold spaces, crossroads, forest edges, and mountain passes. In Tlingit tradition from the Pacific Northwest, the kushtaka is a being that can assume human or animal shapes and often uses mimicry to confuse or lure people. The kushtaka is not directly comparable to the not deer, but the concept of an entity that wears a natural shape imperfectly has resonance with the modern phenomenon. Even European medieval writings include references to forest imitators, animals that appear normal from a distance, but whose proportions or gait betray supernatural influence. These parallels don't prove anything about the not deer, but they demonstrate that cultures widely separated by geography and centuries have recognized the category of beings that fit between natural and supernatural, between familiar and uncanny. Modern witnesses lacking traditional frameworks tend to describe the not deer through instinct rather than inherited language. They often note that the creature seems aware, intelligent, or intentional in its movements. These aren't claims about monsters. They're attempts to articulate the unsettling feeling of encountering something that doesn't match any animal behavior in their experience. Authorities and wildlife professionals tend to respond more cautiously. Their explanations lean towards misidentification, injury, or disease, because those are the categories available to them. And in many cases, those explanations may be correct. But even professionals acknowledge, usually privately, that some details in these accounts fall outside of typical pathology or behavior. What emerges from all of this isn't a definitive explanation, but a set of boundaries. Some aspects of the not deer phenomenon can be attributed to biology, perception, or misinterpretation. Others resist easy categorization, and that friction between what should be possible and what witnesses say they observed is where the meaning of the not deer takes shape. It's not simply a strange deer or a misremembered nighttime shape. It's something that sits uneasily in the space where the natural world fails to explain itself. And for many witnesses, that moment of failure is what lingers long after the encounter ends. Once the biological, behavioral, and psychological explanations are examined, what remains is a category of interpretation that deals not with physical animals, but with the nature of perception, belief, and the boundary between the natural and the supernatural. The not deer sits in an unusual position. It's too physical to be dismissed as hallucination, too inconsistent to be a known species, and too coherent across testimonies to be random misinterpretation. That leaves a landscape of possibilities that don't fit neatly into traditional science, but also don't require abandoning reason. One of the strongest candidates in this category is the idea of thought forms, often called tulpas or egregores. These are entities, conceptual, psychological, or spiritual, that arise from collective belief or attention, not in the sense of imaginary friends, but as emergent shapes created by repeated focus of a community or culture. Modern paranormal researchers sometimes argue that the internet accelerates this process. When a story circulates widely, gathering emotional weight and shared detail, it can influence perception or even produce something that behaves independently of the original narrative. The knot deer is a prime candidate for this theory because its rise coincides with online storytelling. A handful of early posts describing deer-shaped anomalies coalesced into a recognizable pattern. Once given a name, that pattern became easier for people to identify. That doesn't mean the creature is fictional. It means the naming drew together experiences that might have otherwise gone unconnected. Whether thought forms influence only interpretation or something deeper is an open question, but their role in shaping modern folklore is unmistakable. Creepypasta, the modern form of shared digital horror storytelling, plays a part as well, though a more subtle one. Unlike Slender Man or other explicitly fictional entities, the knot deer emerged from people recounting experiences, not crafting narratives. But the platform through which the story spread matters. Creepypasta conditioned online audiences to look for patterns in eerie events and to share them in a similar format. Short, first-person accounts layered with ambiguity. The knot deer phenomena benefited from that narrative structure. The stories feel like fiction even when the authors insist they're not. And that ambiguity allows the accounts to occupy a space where folklore and personal testimony merge. Some researchers treat the knot deer as a form of liminal entity, a being encountered at thresholds, both literal and conceptual. Roads cutting through the woods, edges of towns giving way to the wilderness, mountain overlooks where sight and shadow blend. These places have long been associated with anomalies in folklore worldwide. What stands out in modern knot deer reports is that these encounters rarely happen deep within the wilderness. They happen at the edges, the margins. Liminality is built into the geography. This connects to ideas in theoretical physics as well. The observer effect, often misunderstood but conceptually useful here, suggests that the act of observation changes the behavior of the system being observed. Applied metaphorically, it raises the question whether some phenomena are only visible only when attention is directed at them in a specific way. Many witnesses describe the moment of realization, the instant where their brain shifts from deer to something else, as if the creature revealed its true form only once the observer was ready to see it. This isn't a claim about literal quantum beings. It's a way of recognizing that perception and reality often interact more fluidly than we acknowledge. Another possibility is that the knot deer represents a kind of misaligned mimicry, not from an animal species, but from an intelligence that uses familiar shapes as camouflage. This idea appears in global folklore, but in modern language it's often framed in terms of interdimensional or extra-dimensional entities. These theories propose that beings operating outside our normal physical framework might approximate the forms around them, but imperfectly. They get the broad outline right, but the fine details, the movement, posture, and alignment, reveal the mismatch. Witnesses often describe an uncanny valley effect. The closer the creature is to normal, the more disturbing the discrepancies become. Finally, there's the possibility that the knot deer is a boundary phenomenon, not in the folkloric sense, but in the experiential one. an experience that marks the threshold between the familiar and the unknown, an encounter that forces a reevaluation of what we assume about the natural world. In this interpretation, the creature doesn't need to be fully physical or fully spiritual. It exists in a moment of recognition itself, in the cognitive rupture when an everyday shape stops behaving according to the rules the mind expects. Whether the not deer is a thought form shaped by collective attention, an emergent pattern amplified by digital folklore, a manifestation that slips briefly into the visible world, or something occupying a space between categories, the phenomenon persists because it taps into something deeply rooted in human experience. The instinct to trust the shape of a thing and the shock when that thing becomes changed and that trust is broken. When you look across the stories, the cultural background and the interpretations, the not deer becomes less about a single creature and more about the limits of our understanding. What people describe isn't an animal that behaves unpredictably, it's a form that stops following the rules of the world they know. In that moment of recognition, the break between expectation and reality is where the phenomenon takes place. Some encounters can be explained. Deer do odd things. Darkness distorts perception. Memory reshapes itself. Even when you're telling stories, they change slightly over time. But there are accounts that don't bend easily towards those explanations. Cases where witnesses had clear views, strong familiarity with wildlife, and enough time to understand what they were seeing. Those descriptions aren't spectacular, they're subtle. A joint that bends the wrong way, a movement that doesn't fit, eyes that reflect the wrong way, or, and this is the most unsettling, deer have goat-like pupils. What people are describing when they talk about the not deer is round pupils like humans. Behaviors that contradict instincts of prey. So I'm wondering if that eye shine or the eye shape and its behavior is more like predator. That subtlety is exactly why the not deer leaves such an impression. It doesn't crash through the boundaries of the natural world, it slips across them, quietly, briefly, just enough for someone to realize that the shape they trusted doesn't belong to the behavior or some of the features that they're observing. And once that moment happens, it's difficult to forget. Whether the explanation lies in biology, psychology, folklore, or something that touches the edges of the spiritual and quantum models of reality, the phenomenon reminds us that our world is not as rigid as we sometimes assume. The line between what's natural and what is not is thinner than we'd like. People tell these stories because they experienced something that didn't fit, and they're trying to reconcile their senses with their understanding of the world. In the end, the not deer isn't just a creature, it's a question. A quiet reminder that the unknown doesn't always reveal itself in dramatic ways. Sometimes it appears in the shape of something we see every day, and then waits for us to notice what's wrong. Thank you for joining me tonight on Arcane Station. If you've had an encounter with something that looked familiar but didn't behave the way it should, whether it was a deer or anything else, you're welcome to share your story. You can submit it at arcane-station.com or reach out to me through the contact page, or just use my email, mike@arcane-station.com. If this episode resonated with you, consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing the show with someone who enjoys these deep dives into strange phenomena. Your support helps this project grow and allows me to keep exploring the mysteries that don't fit neatly into the world we think we understand. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and remember, the unknown often hides in plain sight. This is Mike Porter, signing off.